It is not wrong to have a makom kavua, to have a set place.
This is my set place.
In the Beit HaMidrash, in the place of study, or in the Beit Tefillah, and in the sanctuary. So
yeah, but I didn't choose a sheet seat. Everyone just kept kicking me out.
Well, the important thing is we're not kicking you out. Right? You found a place, and you will definitely own that as your own.
I just sit there actually.
And on the other hand, it's also a question of first come, first serve.
Yeah.
Okay, at least it should be. Right? If you want to save your seat, the easiest way is to sit in it before anyone else gets here, and then it shouldn't be a complaint. All right, so we are now in chapter 5. Yay! We made it to a new chapter. Only 3 more to go.
1:4:12, I think.
No, we finished 4:12, didn't we?
No, we did chapter 4:11.
Hold on a second. Where's 4:12? No. We definitely did the gap in the roof of when you had a roof, like the portico, and there was a gap, a split in the roof, and the person was inside.
Yeah.
I remember drawing the picture about a person being the tent of being hollow inside.
Yes.
So yeah, I'm definitely sure we did 4:12. Because I made it my point, even though we went a bit late last week, to finish chapter 4. Because that was a long one, because there's so many digressions, but which is all the point of learning. But it did take a while to get through. It's not like, as I mentioned when we very, very, very first began Eduyot, unlike other Masechtot of Mishnah, it doesn't pick a topic and stay with it, so that you can build up familiarity. It'll pick a topic and then jump to a new topic and then jump to a new topic, and that does make it harder to get through the material. But it also exposes you to a huge range of different topics. And hopefully that is a worthwhile endeavor, even if it can be a little harder to climb that hill. All right, Eduyot 5:1. We are continuing with Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disputes, as we will through pretty much all of chapter 5. But we're going to get now our lists of the disputes based on the records of different sages. So different sages are going to say, I know of X number of disputes between Shammai and Hillel. Make sense? As how we're going to categorize these, right? These are not just generic disputes coming as a generic list. These are lists of particular traditions of different sages, of disputes that they have. Good? Good. All right. So I'm not going to do any, these ones are fairly easy to jump into. We're not going to jump into any previews on each of them, I hope, and we'll be okay. So let's go ahead with chapter 5, Mishnah 1.
Rabbi Judah says, there are 6 instances of lenient rulings by Beit Shammai and stringent rulings by Beit Hillel.
Again, which is not quite the typical pattern. And again, as well, remember that the definition of lenient and stringent is sometimes hard for us to really understand. But we'll see how this goes. These ones are fairly straightforward of what you would suspect lenient versus stringent might mean.
So number 1 is the blood of a carcass. Beit Shammai pronounces it clean. Beit Hillel pronounces it unclean.
All right. So imagine you got a cow, right? Kosher or non-kosher?
Well,
Cow is a kosher animal, right? Kosher animal. Great. And you've got a kosher cow. It's standing there in the field, and it falls over dead. Can you eat it or not?
No.
Not right. This is nevela, right? It is an animal that died without proper ritual slaughter.
Right.
Just keels over dead. Doesn't matter the cause, right? It's dead. You're not allowed to eat it, and its food is not allowed to be used. It would render things ritually impure. It's flesh. Sorry. What about its blood? Right? It's flesh, we know, but what about its blood?
Well, we don't eat the blood anyway, so what difference does it make?
Okay, so we can we can go the route that the blood is immaterial, but it is material. That is to say, it is substance, right? So if I take the heart of this cow that died and I squeeze it into a little bucket and I pour that bucket of blood over other things, are you okay with that?
No.
No.
Absolutely not.
If I poured it over something and then removed it, if it was something that could render something ritually impure, even though I wiped it off, I'm not eating it. But if it is possible to be ritually impure, it would have left impurity behind. So it does matter. It's a little funny. It's kind of like the Merchant of Venice, right? A pound of flesh, but do you also include the blood? Right? Right? It's a little bit of whether you include the blood in the measure of the flesh. I don't know that Shakespeare knew of this particular section of debate in Jewish law, but in any case, Shammai says that the blood itself is not ritually impure, whereas Beit Hillel says that yes, the blood is ritually impure. So therefore, it is also off limits in all senses.
Why is the blood not considered part of the body like everything else is?
Well, in this particular case, Beit Hillel is saying it is, right? Beit Shammai is the one who is saying, yeah, but it's not actually the flesh. And, flesh is flesh and blood is blood. And if flesh is impure, that doesn't mean blood is impure. And as we're going to see in a couple minutes, bodily fluids can take up an awful lot of time to discuss. But if you thought that was unusual, let's talk about an egg.
An egg found in a bird's carcass.
All right, so I've got a bird, and it's a dead bird. And I cut open the dead bird, and inside the dead bird, I find an egg. Right, it's in the bird.
Yeah.
Right, because it hadn't been hatched yet. It was still inside the bird. Everyone got the image?
This is a bird that died from unnatural causes, right?
But yes, because we're talking about a carcass rather than a properly slaughtered chicken. So go ahead and what were you saying about eating?
I remember when Mother used to make some chicken soup sometimes, little ayalaf would be in there. It was little like egg yolks that it must have been inside the chicken when she bought the chicken. I was a kosher chicken and she bought it at the market. But she would boil them in the soup as well. So we'd have the matzo balls and the ayalaf little eggs.
I've never had that myself, but because you don't get natural living chickens anymore, right? The chickens you buy in the market are not chickens that were ever, the chickens that we eat are not the same chickens that make eggs for us. Because they're a totally different species, not species, but they're totally different technologies for how they were bred and how they are used to produce their product. So yeah, you would never find a modern broiler, that would have that particular type of condition.
I haven't thought about that since I was a child, but you're right. Back in those days, she didn't buy her stuff in the supermarket. She went to the kosher butcher shop who had the chickens laying there on the counter.
And a chicken was a chicken,
Yes,
right? It was a nice egg-laying chicken until it stopped, and when it stopped, it became dinner. Right? What was the old Jew, the old Joe? When you see a Jew eating a chicken, one of them is sick. Right? You didn't kill the chicken until something was potentially going wrong with it because you couldn't afford to eat your egg layer. But if you were sick, you needed something to help you recover. And if the chicken was sick, you didn't want to let it die and become nevela. You wanted to slaughter it before that happened so that you wouldn't lose the meat as well as the chicken.
And the term nevela, nevela that you use,
yes,
because I know nevaira, which is a sin. Avaira, but it's a vela.
That's a vera.
Avera, yes, right.
Yeah.
Avera.
But nevela is with the nun at the beginning.
Yes.
Right.
Is
the carcass.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I knew it wasn't a sin that you were talking about.
Avera, or the Yiddish version of it.
Yeah,
is a sin. Right.
Sounded so close. Yeah. An egg found in a bird's carcass. If the like of it were sold in the market, it is permitted. If not, it's forbidden, according to the opinion of Beit Shammai.
All right, so the question is, and maybe this is even a clearer issue than the blood, is the egg part of the chicken or is the egg not part of a chicken? Meaning, when does the egg become a separate entity? Because everybody agrees that an egg is parv, right? An egg is not the meat of the chicken, but everyone also agrees that it came out of a chicken, right? The chicken's body produced it, just like the chicken's body produces that lovely drumstick. So at what point in the production does it stop being part of the body and become a separate entity? Really? The hatching? So
it comes out.
No,
you mean the laying? The laying
of the egg.
Right, hatching is when it breaks open. Right?
Okay.
The laying.
So
If the
my
chicken-
English.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
If
Right.
the chicken is alive, it lays an egg and it dies.
Right.
That egg is okay. But if the chicken is sitting there, it dies, and then the egg comes out.
Well, that's the question, right? The chicken falls over dead, and you're like, man, and you cut it open and you find an egg inside, right? Is it okay to use that egg or not okay? And what is Beit Shammai's opinion? He says, if the egg is formed enough that someone could take that out at the market and sell it, and someone would say, I'll buy that egg, then that's an egg, right? Not a post or not a mid-ovulation of a chicken. That's an egg, right? If, on the other hand, if you tried to sell that in the market, everyone would say, what kind of egg is that? That's not an egg, that's right? Then that, well, or the texture of the shell is not properly formed, or other issues that could be with it, then that was still chickeny, and therefore it goes with the rest of the body, and it is off the menu. And Hillel, on the other hand, said, Hillel forbids it, right? Hillel says, no, if it comes out of the corpse, then it is not going to be a kosher egg, no matter what. However, they get an agreement.
But they do agree in the case of an egg found in a treif bird that is forbidden, since it had its growth in a forbidden condition.
Right? If it was growing inside of a eagle, right? That's a bird that's not a kosher bird. Sorry. Review my brain. I was just trying to explain this using modern classical translation, but this is not. This is legal translation. Right? Treif in this particular case is not a case of a non-kosher animal. Treif in this case is more the original intent, which is a wounded animal, a torn animal. And the treif in that sense, not the Yiddish sense, the treif in that sense is what we're talking about in this case. Sorry for that slip. Right? So the question is here, imagine I've got a chicken and the chicken was attacked by a fox. And the chicken is suffering, living, suffering, and then it dies. And then you open up the chicken, right? So it's not an nevela. It didn't just go boom and fall over, right? It was mortally wounded and all of that. Then does that egg count? Well, since the egg was forming and being created by the wounded bird, by the treif bird, then it takes on the characteristics of the wounded, of the treif bird, and therefore it is off the menu. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we're still looking at cases of lenient ruling by Shammai and strict ruling by Beit Hillel.
We're going to be doing that for a long time.
Yes, in the case of the blood of a non-Jewish woman, and the blood of purity of a leprous woman. Beit Shammai pronounces them clean, and Beit Hillel says it is like her spittle and her urine.
Okay. It's a little confusing here, right?
Yeah.
All right. So Torah talks about birth. Right? When a woman gives birth, she enters into two different issues. It's slightly different. The numbers are doubled if it's a girl compared to a boy that she gave birth to. But I'm just going to write up the boy numbers because it's easier. Right? So if the woman gives birth to a boy, right, she's got 7 days, and then she's got an additional 40 days. During the 7 days, right, she is ritually impure. Right? 7 days after the birth, ritually impure. 40 days, and then she goes to the mikveh. 40 days, she is pure, no matter what you see. Right? Even if there is still discharge, even if there is still blood, even if there are other things, she is still considered to be ritually pure. You with me so far? Okay. So the question is, this is for a Jewish woman. What about a non-Jew? Right? Does a non-Jew have the same status? That during those 40 days, she's considered ritually pure. That's what they're basically arguing over. And the same thing also goes, what's that? Well, but the same thing, well, we're actually going to get to what happens if a Jewish woman doesn't go to the mikveh either. But the question then is also about a similar case for a mitzorah, for a woman who is suffering from the tzara'at, the leprous condition, right? What is their status? Do they follow this set of rules, or do they follow a different set of rules because of their non-Jewish status? Right? Is it a function of their Jewishness, or is it a function of just somehow the physicality of what is transpiring and the calendar? And again, we get a debate. Shammai says that the non-Jews follow the same pattern as the Jewish, and the Beit Hillel says no, it follows its own standard, which is it doesn't count as being pure. Make sense? Because Beit Hillel says it's like our spittle and urine, which we are told explicitly are out of bounds, right? So the blood and would then follow that same category. Make sense? Okay, I don't want to go into too much more detail on this, although we're gonna loop back around to this in a little bit, but that should get us through this for the moment. 5.
One may eat fruits of the 7th year with an expression of thanks and without an expression of thanks to the owner of the field, according to the opinion of Beit Shammai. But Beit Hillel says one may not eat with an expression of thanks.
Okay, and again, it's important to note from the parentheses that the thanks we're talking about here is the thanks to the owner of the field, because that's important in the 7th year. Because in the 7th year, what happens?
It's ownerless.
It's ownerless, right? The land rests, so I'm not out plowing my field, and anything growing in that field is not because of my direct labor. But if I still own the field, I mean, the property is still mine. No one says that the property isn't mine. Even if it's not my wheat, it's just whatever is growing wild from the last time I was there, and you come and you take some of that wheat, which is your right because the sabbatical year says it's your right, shouldn't you at least say, thank you, man? This wheat that I'm getting is from your land, even though it is technically ownerless this year. Shouldn't I at least have the option to say thank you to the owner? Mm-hmm. And Beit Shammai says, yeah. Right? If you take the food off the land and you eat it and you don't say thank you to the owner, that's cool. And if you want to say thank you to the owner, that's cool. Right? He's lenient. Whereas Beit Hillel says, nope, you are not allowed to say thank you. I know, it's opposite of what I told you in kindergarten.
Yeah.
So I mean, this you can probably work out for yourself. What reason would Beit Hillel have for telling people they're not allowed to say thank you to the owner of the land?
He didn't do anything for them.
Partly he didn't do anything for them, but let's be honest. I mean, the food that's growing off the residue of his work is still something that I'm benefiting from. The trees that are in his orchard, he's the one who's been caring for them. He's the one who's been pruning them. He's the one who's been working on the field that he has. He's the one who's been keeping the weeds at bay. He's the one who's been keeping the gophers out. He's the one who has the irrigation system set up. Even if he's not actively tending it that year, the land is productive thanks to him and his family. So even if he didn't go out with the plow this year, certainly what he did last year has made a difference this year.
And it wasn't his choice to give it away either.
Okay. So it wasn't his choice to give it away because who owns the land during this time?
No.
Or who owns no one owns the produce. So to say thank you to the owner is to misunderstand the gift of the sabbatical year. Right? And it might seem like a harmless thing, which is probably why Shammai has his opinion, which is to say, no, acknowledge that this is from, Mr. Smith's land, even if Mr. Smith is technically not the owner. And Beit Hillel is saying that technical is important. In fact, it's primary. It's not just a kind of sort of technically it's not his. It's you have to remember every 7 years that it is ownerless across the board. That's how you remember every 7 years that we're only renting it, that we are the current tenants, that God has allowed to use the land. And if you still say thank you to the guy, even while you take from the land, you are forgetting that point. And you are losing that as part of your spiritual core, that ultimately the land belongs to God. Yes, God has given us long-term leases to use it for, 50 technically, but even longer than that, right? Is our lifetime. We're allowed to work the land and work at any jobs and enjoy the benefit of this world. And God has given us that prerogative to create wealth and to use wealth and support ourselves. But ultimately, we are just leaseholders. We're not the ultimate owners in the capital U ultimate sense. And the sabbatical is meant to remind us that, and remind us of that. And so once every 7 years to say, I'm not going to, tip my cap to Mr. Smith, because tipping my hat to Mr. Smith means that I never remember that I really should be tipping my hat to God. That's where Beit Hillel is coming from. Make sense? That one's a little bit easier than the blood flow to get our heads around. And then
Beit Shammai says a water skin is liable to become impure only if it is tied up and remains unimpaired. And the school of Hillel says even if it is not tied up.
All right, so remember, vessels and items have to be both finished and intact in order to become ritually impure. If they are broken or if they're not done, then they're not ritually impure. We've talked about this for lots of different items before. Well, a water skin, what counts as being done, right? Does it have to be tied up, which might be considered, Beit Shammai says, the final act of making it actually a usable utensil, or even if it's not tied up, it still holds water. Is that good enough? They both agree, of course, that it can't be broken, because once it's broken, then it's broken and no longer susceptible. But the argument is, at what point does it become susceptible in the first place? When is it finished? Or when is it good enough? And again, Beit Hillel says, just being a water skin is good enough. And Beit Shammai says, no, you got to actually do that last little bit of, tightening and tying it up. And that's where they argue. Pretty straightforward on that one. Okay. 5-2.
Rabbi Yosef says there are 6 instances of lenient rulings by Beit Shammai and stringent rulings by Beit Hillel.
All right, so we had Rabbi Yehuda the first time. Now we got Rabbi Yossi, or Yosei rather. So let's see what his instances are.
The first one is a fowl may be put on a table together with cheese, but may not be eaten with it, according to the opinion of Beit Shammai.
Go ahead and do
Beit
Beit
Hillel
Hillel.
says it may neither be put on the table together with it nor eaten with it.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, if I had a nickel for
Yeah.
for everybody who asks me about the whole chickens and cheese thing.
That's
Just
right.
it drives me nuts. I mean, I get it. As I think I've mentioned to this group before, if I haven't, I've probably mentioned to you at least some of the point. I was raised without keeping kosher, and I chose to become somebody who would be observant of kashrut, beginning in my late teen years and then through my college years. And I did it step by step and process by process. And yeah, this frustrated me when I was first coming across it. Well, do chickens have nipples? Right? I mean,
There's no milk of chickens.
there's no milk from chickens. And the Torah says, the meat in the milk. And when I did agree that meat with the milk of the mother probably didn't only mean goats, and it probably didn't only mean the mother of that particular goat, because that seemed to me to be a rather narrow and petty distinction. And so I accepted that the rabbinic position was the more generic idea of any meat with any milk.
Yeah.
However, it did still seem to be a little odd that we wouldn't be allowed to eat poultry with any milk. And indeed, the rabbi said that as far as the Torah was concerned, it wasn't a problem, right? That the Torah never talked about poultry and milk. So why don't we do it? Well, the official reason given by the rabbis is what's known as marit ayin, that it gives an appearance to a thing, right? It looks to the eye like you are doing that. And if you look up one of my more recent Pathways to Judaism class on kashrut, you'll see the pictures of what meat in the ancient world used to look like and what poultry in the ancient world used to look like. A lot more game hen, a lot more wild fowl, which is a much darker, ruddy kind of meat. And most people did not have these beautiful marbled steaks like they do now. They had bits of goat and lamb and bone scrapings if they were lucky, which also were not big slabs of steak or roast. They were piecemeal. And if you put some pieces of duck next to some pieces of lamb, it is much harder to tell the difference, especially once they've been cooked in a stew. So that actual makes sense, that it was hard to tell the difference between the two, and therefore the rabbi said, don't eat them together, because it's going to make other people think that it's happening, because it's going to look exactly the same. All right, and eventually, I came to swallow that. I came to accept that position, and I would never mix poultry with milk at this point. But why can't I have them on the same table?
Well, one
Right.
of the things I used to tell my kids, back in the days before cell phones, when we had payphones, Rabbi Neely may not go into McDonald's to make a phone call.
Right.
Because people seeing Rabbi Neely going into McDonald's, they think it's okay to eat there. So I don't care what the problem is, you may not go in there for a phone call. You're not eating anything,
Right.
you're not touching anything.
So Marit Ayin can be extended, but
Yeah.
but let's talk about this issue here of cheese and poultry
On the same table.
on the table. I'm not cooking them.
But still, you're gonna not, you're gonna have to think about it, you might.
All right. So one of the explanations that's given, right, one of the explanations that's given for Beit Hillel's opinion is because if you put them on the same table, you might come to eat, right? That even if I don't normally and wouldn't normally, food's in front of me and I'm having a conversation. I mean, you remember what it's like to have a conversation at dinner, or I'm reading on my phone or doing something else, watching TV. Food's in front of me, food that I normally can eat and I can eat. It's all kosher. How easy would it be for me to just, stick a fork in my mouth that had the wrong thing on it? It's a fairly legitimate concern. Indeed, that's one reason why there are rules of why you can eat at a table with someone else that you're not accustomed to eating with, and they are allowed to have the opposite food, right? So if you were in a picnic setting and you were out with your schoolmates or something, and some guy had a meat sandwich and you had a dairy sandwich, right? And you don't normally share food and you don't normally swap. That's fine, right? For him to sit on his side of the tablecloth, or the picnic blanket, and for me to sit on my side and not to swap food back and forth, and it's okay for him to have his roast beef and me to have my cheese. I'm not like I have to run away from him. But if it's my own food at my own table, I'm used to eating my own food at my own table, and I won't be as careful. But Beit Shammai says, look, you're not breaking any laws, and if they're in their constituent forms, the issue of Marit Ayin, of appearance, is not really a question, right? A slab of cheese over here and a slab of duck over here, no one's going to think that there actually is confusion going on here. So what's the big deal? That's the fundamental argument that they're having. Of course, Beit Hillel's position is the normative one, the one that we follow. All right, 2.
Olives may be given as teruma for oil and grapes for wine, according to the opinion of Beit Shammai. But Beit Hillel says they may not be given.
Okay, so truma is a technical term. It is the gift of food that we give to the Kohen. And we take truma from a produce in order to give, right? So if I harvest my olives, I have to give some of it to the Kohanim. And if I harvest my grapes, I have to give some of them to the Kohanim. Everyone, that makes sense, right? The question is, if I harvest some of my grapes and I take some of my grapes and I make them into wine, and I harvest some of my olives and I take some of my olives and turn them into oil, can I give the truma from the olives I made into oil from the olives that are still regular olives? Can I give the truma for the olives for the grapes I turned into wine from the grapes that are still grapes? Or do I have to give wine to the Kohen? Do I have to give olive oil to the Kohen? Everyone follow what the question is, right? It's once I've transformed it, is it still part of the olive batch? At which point I can still use olives to do the truma donation. Or when I've transformed it, is it now a separate food and therefore it needs its own truma to go for that separateness? And the opinions are, did we get the opinions out? I think you said them right. The opinions are from Beit Shammai, which is, look, they're still olives. I know they're crushed up and juiced olives, but you can use the olives to give the truma for the whole species of food. And you can give the grapes for the whole species of food. Whereas Beit Hillel says, no, olives and olive oil, grapes and wine, those are separate foodstuffs, and they each need their own truma. Excuse me. And because they are distinct. Does that make sense?
Is there a timing issue here? Basically, like if you get the stuff and if you tithe it, then turn it to wine.
Well, this isn't technically a tithe. The truma is slightly different, but it does need to be done before you can appreciate it, before you can enjoy it.
Right. So I mean, like, let's say you didn't intend to turn the grapes into wine. You're just eating grapes and they're already tithed. Then turn it to wine. Do you still have to get truma from that, or is these are grapes specifically taken for the purpose of turning to wine?
Usually, I think you would know what you were doing beforehand. I'm not sure if you change your mind after you've already harvested your grapes and after you've given truma from your grapes. I'm not sure whether you would then be able to go back and use the rest of it for wine. My gut tells me that once you've given truma from a harvest, you're okay. But if you haven't given truma and you turn it into two different products, then the question is, can I use the original product or do I have to use the secondary product for the secondary truma?
So Shammai says yes, but Beth Hill says not.
Beit Shammai says you can use the original, right?
So purpose of taking the grapes make it different because that goes to what the end product is, right? Because that's what you're tithing is the finished product, not the.
No, you tithe the produce, right? But the statement you gave me was if I already tithed it, which would include giving also truma, so now I can eat it, and then I'm halfway through my grape harvest, and I say, you know what? I can't finish all this. Let's make wine.
Right.
You've already tithed and trumified it, so that probably should be okay. Again, I can't swear. It's not something that I have to do every day. But I'm pretty sure that would already have been fine. But on the other hand, if you harvest it in and you put some over here for winemaking and some over here for eating, then the question becomes, how do I handle the two batches? Are they now two different foodstuffs or are they still the same that happen to be in two different forms?
And
yeah,
let's say the wine batch, you have it set aside for wine, but
right.
You're busy and you're not going to turn it to wine until next week, then you don't have to tithe for a whole week, right?
Yes, you have a delay until it becomes needed. The same thing, as well when you are pickling olives, which you would, most of the olives would not go straight into your stomach. They would go into brine in order to be preserved. Because if you just leave the olives sitting around, they're going to rot. So yeah, it's as they are prepared for use that the tithing and truma becomes important. One of the things that's interesting on this topic, however, is that there's also a question of preference, a question of what's the term? Of the transformation of a product, the added value that comes from the transformation of the product. Both wine and olive oil were considered the true product of grapes and olives, right? Grapes are not considered to be all that great by themselves, right? Grapes are good because you can make wine from them. And wine is really the chief form of the food that comes from that vine that grows in the back of the house. Same thing with olives, right? The true form of the food that comes from the olive is the oil, not the meaty little, I'm going to crunch on it, and enjoy my olives. That being said, then, when you have transformed your grapes into wine or your olives into olive oil, you have added a great deal of labor and usually a capital investment of having wine press, olive press, and all of the other things that go along with that. So the question of then taking truma from the finished product would technically be a greater gift, right? What's the greater gift? Giving someone a pile of steel and a couple bits of oil, or giving someone a car? Right? Same raw products, but one of them has had a lot of value added to it by the energy and the innovation necessary to transform the raw materials into the true product. And that might make me less willing to hand someone wine compared to handing someone a bunch of grapes. And it might also make the Kohanim more eager to get a bottle of wine than it would be to get a bunch of grapes, because with a bunch of grapes from a bunch of different people, he's probably not going to be able to make wine for himself. Whereas with wine from people, that is something he can, store and use as needed. So there may also be an economic issue that's underlying why someone might be interested in giving the wine truma from grapes and the olive oil truma from olives. But that's an economy that we don't deal with quite as much as we do with car manufacturing. All right, 5.
One who's, we're up to 3, right?
Oh, sorry, yes.
One who sows seed within 4 cubits of a vineyard. Beit Shammai says, he has caused 1 row of vines to be prohibited. But Beit Hillel says, he has caused 2 rows to be prohibited.
Okay, so we're not allowed to mix species when we plant our vineyard or our fields. And so the question happens, what happens if you do, and what is the minimum? And the minimum that you have to worry about is, here's my vine. I've got on each side of the vine a 4 cubit dead zone, right, that I cannot use. 4 cubits is about 6 feet. So if I plant, my wheat here, then they're off limits. But if I plant my wheat, here, outside the 4 cubit line, then it's not a question. I mean, it's perfectly fine. However, what happens if I plant it here and there are multiple rows of vines? I mean, a lot of people have vineyards that have more than 1 vine. And the question is, how far into the vineyard does this contaminate, this cross planting? Beit Shammai says it's just the one row, right? The closest one, because by the time you get to this one, you're outside of what the zone would be, and therefore it's not an issue. Beit Hillel says, on the other hand, no, it's the first 2, right? Because it's the distance between the other product, the other crop. The other crop is not just touching this, but it's also on the other side of it, which is still connected to the vine that's growing on the other side. So it covers a more of the vineyard rather than just vine of the way of looking at it. So again, from most standpoints, that would be a stringent view of saying you lose more of your vine by having planted within the distance that was forbidden.
You're definitely going to have to remove those.
Well, you wouldn't have to remove the vine, but you would definitely have to remove this, and you wouldn't be able to harvest what you had gotten from those vines. Those vines would be off limits. Good? Okay.
Can you sell them to non-Jews?
No.
No?
Now, because you're still benefiting from it. Yeah, you're still benefiting from it.
Flour paste is flour that has been mixed with boiling water. Beit Shammai exempts it from the law of challah, but Beit Hillel pronounces it liable.
All right, so this is, again, technically what we call challah. I know a lot of people, when we hear the word challah, they think of the loaves of bread that we have on Friday night and Saturday for celebrating Shabbat. And yes, that is called challah. That's perfectly fine. But there is also technically challah, which is usually, we talk in English, we talk about taking challah, which is when you are making a batch of dough, we take a bit of the dough off, depends on how big of a batch you're making, that's a whole nother class, and that piece is supposed to be given to the Kohanim based on the Torah's commandment. Since we don't have the Kohanim that we can give that to nowadays, it is simply destroyed. And it's off limits to us, and in the end, it's off limits to everybody. The question here is, what if I am not baking my bread? What if I am boiling my bread, right? If I am boiling it if I'm doing it with boiling water, then it's not technically a baked product that I am making. So do I still have to take challah or not? And once again, Beit Shammai gives the lenient view, which is you don't. And Beit Hillel gives the stricter view, which says, yes, you still have to. Make sense? Okay. Part 5, that one's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. One may immerse himself in a rain torrent, according to the opinion of Beit Shammai, but Beit Hillel says one may not immerse oneself in a rain torrent.
All right. So, who here has been to a wadi?
Oh, I see. Oh, yes.
A wadi.
In the desert. Oh, absolutely.
Yes, or an arroyo. If you want the arroyo, right? If you want the Spanish term, or at least my version of the Spanish term, right? So, if you've ever been to a place where there is often dryness, but then there can be sudden rains, you'll get these seasonal rivers, right? That's what they're talking about here for a torrent. So you've got this mountain, and along the mountain, wait, I've got a blue marker, and along the mountain, the water is running down. So, if Joe Israel is laying down on the mountainside, and the water is rushing down around him, is that a mikveh or is that not a mikveh?
That's to be a mikvah.
Well, that's the debate.
It's a lot of
Right?
water.
Well, that's the thing, right? So 40 seah, right? 40 seah is enough to make a mikveh. And between
And he's immersed in it.
here
Not
and
just
here,
flowing water, right?
Well, it's along the sides, and it may not be over his head, but it's
Right.
flowing right alongside him.
there's definitely 40 seahs between the top of the mountain and the bottom of the mountain, right? It's just like if you were to go into a river, right? Even if the river you're in is fairly small, trust me, the river is long, there's definitely more than 40 seah to make that a kosher mikveh. And the question is whether or not that is sufficient for what we would call a mikveh for ritual purposes. Might be fun, but is it actually a mikveh? Beit Shammai again says yes. The whole thing is basically contiguous. It is a solid kind of stream of water, and presuming it meets all the other qualifications, meaning that it is covering you completely, then good enough, right? Good enough. And Beit Hillel says no, right? A torrent is not the same thing as a river, right? A river is a stable, contiguous body of water, whereas a torrent is a fluctuating, undulating, and not exactly reliably attached body of water. And there's no way to clearly and definitively know that we've got what is the making of a mikveh here. The safe thing to do would simply be to dig a hole, let the rainwater fill it up, and then dunk. Right? Then we know we're okay. And that's one of the ways you can fill a mikveh is by collecting rainwater rushing off a hill.
What about natural cascades? Like, in Puerto Rico, there's a lot of mountains, especially where I was, because it's the rainforest.
Right.
And so a ton of
Like a waterfall.
Waterfalls all the time. Would that be considered a mikveh? But you have to have something that you can it's just coming down.
Okay, so
It's
let's imagine we've got a little bit of a sharper mountain, right? To do the waterfall style. So I've got my mountain and the water is coming over and it's coming down as a waterfall.
Exactly.
And then, there's like a little pond.
Just a little pond,
Yeah, like a pond underneath, right? Okay, if the pond is sufficient, then yes, it can be a mikveh. If the pond is like up to your ankles,
No.
then it's not. Because the problem here, and this is where it's a little bit clearer of what the other issue could be with this torrent, is technically when the water's falling, it is not a stream. It looks like a stream. It definitely sounds like a stream. And if you put your hand out, it'll feel like a stream. But if you take a picture of it with a really, really high-speed camera, you can see that it's just a billion drops of water. Each one is separate. So you would never be in the water all at once. You would be water hit here, water hit here, water hit, and it would just be sprayed across you. Even if it felt like you were underwater, you're not actually underwater. A good explanation for why this works or why this wouldn't work is the same reason you can breathe when you're in the shower, right? Even though the water is all flowing around you, you can still breathe usually quite easily unless you're staring right up into the nozzle. Because the water's not really all over you, right? There is a lot of gap between it all. And that allows it. Of course, one of the reasons that that's happening is the same reason why waterfalls are so amazing, because you get to see a rainbow, and the only way you can see a rainbow is if there's spray. Right? If water is just flowing as a solid sheet, you don't get the rainbow. It's only because it's spraying out all the droplets that we get that wonderful effect. So if you see a rainbow, it's not one solid system. Now, if you were standing in a giant tube of water and the water was flowing past you and you were, like on a grate and you could just sort of jump up a little bit so the water could surround you all at once, then yeah, that could work. But the whole thing would have to be completely submerging you, right? And that would probably be rather scary to be trapped in a tube full of water and there's no way to get your head above water. That would be more terrifying, and you probably wouldn't be worried about using the mikveh right now. You'd be like, help, get me out of here. Okay, so enough with odd creative mikveh uses. Part 6,
One who became a proselyte on the eve of Passover.
right? Somebody converts, but they convert on the day when that night there's going to be a Seder, right? So what's the issue here? The issue is that to actually eat from the Seder of Pesach, not the Seder that we call the Seder, but the actual the korban, right? The sacrifice, the special lamb that was offered up at the temple. In order to eat from that, you have to be not only Jewish, but more specifically, you have to be circumcised, right? You have to have been fully into the people of Israel. And the question is, if you do that right before the Passover begins, right before you would be having that sacrifice, is that okay, right? Did you make the cutoff?
Cut off.
Get it? Sorry.
Oh.
It's a circumcision joke. I just had a Brit Milah earlier today. So did you make the cutoff? Or no, sorry, you're going to have to wait until next month when we do the makeup Passover. Remember, there is a makeup Passover a month later in the days of yore.
Is it that he has to heal? Is that what the problem is?
No.
Circumcised.
It's a question of ritual purity, right? When does the ritual impurity that you have from being non-Jewish go away?
Oh. Not 100%.
7 days.
Well, this is the debate. So read.
So Beis Shammai says he may immerse himself and eat his Passover sacrifice that evening.
Right. So just like we do now, you and everybody agrees it's necessary. You go to the Beit Din, you would go to the mikveh, and you come out of the mikveh, you're good, right? You're a new person, and more importantly, you are a ritually pure person, not only a converted person, but ritually pure and therefore able to eat the Passover sacrifice. However,
Beit Hillel says who separates himself from uncircumcision is as one who separates himself from the grave.
Right. So as we've talked about a number of times, the most severe form of ritual impurity is having come into contact with the dead. And that's what he's talking about here from the grave. Right. So he's saying if you were to come into contact with the corpse, you would have to wait 7 days from after your contact finished before you would be able to immerse and to then be able to be considered ritually pure for anyone, right? If I was part of the Chevra Kadisha one week and Passover was coming up, I'd be out of luck, right? If there was fewer than 7 days between me and Passover. It's necessary, and that's a reason why we have the makeup Passover, I should point out, and why it's considered to be important in the Torah for having that option, is so that people who are ritually impure will not be just left behind for the Passover ceremony. But it would be an unfortunate side effect of me doing a mitzvah of taking care of someone who needed to be buried. I would disqualify myself for a week from any ritual activity that required ritual impurity. Required ritual purity. Yes.
That's sort of like Shiva week, which is 7 days after you buried somebody. Oh.
It's not just a coincidence.
No,
Yeah, 7 days as a period of separation from the dead is the standard idea for a variety of different source texts within the Torah. So the notion here, Hillel is saying, or Beit Hillel is saying, is that when you are circumcised, we have to conceive of it not just as going from being ritually impure to ritually pure, but as going from the most extreme form of ritual impurity to being ritually pure. And the most extreme form is being in contact with the dead. And therefore, you need a week. So if you do it in the afternoon, you can't come to Seder tonight, right? But you can definitely come next month, right? Next month, you'll be fine. And you can do the makeup Seder and everything's good. And if you do it more than a week before Passover, you're fine. But you don't do it last minute, right? Give yourself a little bit of time. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me take a look at 5.3 here. And no, I think we can do 5.3. It's not too bad.
So Rabbi Yishmael says there are 3 instances of lenient rulings by Beis Shammai and strict rulings by Beit Hillel. First, the book of Ecclesiastes does not defile the hands, according to the opinion of Beis Shammai, but Beit Hillel says it does defile the hands.
Okay. The book of Kohelet. Right. So here's the question, or rather, here's the base information. The base information is that the Sefer Torah that we have in the Ark, if you touch that, your hands have become ritually impure. Now, I know you probably think the Torah, nothing is more holy and pure than the Torah. Yeah, true. But the rabbis decreed that the sacred texts, like the Torah, make one's hands ritually impure. Why? Because what happens if your hands are ritually impure? You can't eat, right? So that means you can't eat while using any of the texts. Right? You know all those librarians when you were kids who told you don't eat while reading from the books? Yeah, the rabbis, they did one better. They say no food around the books, because any food around the books is becoming ritually impure. And this was a very, very strict protective measure to make sure that they actually talk about the idea of if you had the Sfarim, the scrolls, stored somewhere, people would also put truma, because truma was supposed to be ritually pure. And then mice and rats would come to eat the food, and they would also eat the scrolls. So this was like the way that the rabbis could stop people from doing that. There's a whole long discussion about how people who often were not observant of one part of Judaism might be observant of others. And one of the things that many people who were in other ways not careful about Judaism, but still in the ancient world were following, were issues of purity. And in particular, the food purity issues. So it's not only in the modern world that we have people who sort of pick and choose how they observe. In the ancient world, they did as well. And the rabbis used one of the issues that a lot of people still observed, even if they weren't careful about other things, to try and protect how people would treat the sacred books. So the sacred books make the hands ritually impure. What counts as a sacred book? That's what this particular Mishnah is about, right? Does the book of Kohelet, does the book of Ecclesiastes count as sacred enough for us to say that it will make the hands ritually impure? And Beit Shammai says, no, it doesn't. And if you've ever read the book of Kohelet, you might be able to guess why. The book of Kohelet does not read like your average part of the Tanakh. The book of Kohelet is written by someone who at many times seems to completely give up on the idea of give up on the idea of living a good life. Because what's the point? We're all going to die. Smart people, dumb people, we all die, right? Good people, bad people, we all die. Why bother? Let me just go get drunk today and, do what I feel like.
I thought that book was attributed to Solomon.
It is. And that's one of the reasons why it made the cut. A, because it was written by Solomon. And B, when you get to the very end, he's like, look, on our own, humans, we can't exactly figure out what the best way to live is. But what I can tell you is follow what God has given us, and that will be good. So that very last sentence basically saved the rest of the book. Not to say the rest of the book doesn't also have important spiritual truths and also just good insights for what it means to think about life deeply. But without that last line, or without the idea that it was written by Solomon, there's a good chance that the book of Ecclesiastes would not have been recognized as divine by the community. And that's really what they're arguing over here, is whether or not that book counts as divine enough for us to say that it too would render the hands ritually impure. Make sense? Shir HaShirim was also on the edge of whether or not it would be considered Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. These are the two that were the most. Megillah were not; those were not a problem. But these two, yeah, they were right on the edge. I mean, Shir HaShirim in particular was considered to be just, a poem about love, and quite a graphic poem about love. If you have any imagination and how to interpret metaphor, it's kind of racy. Yeah, yeah. There's no illustrated version of the Shir HaShirim. But the rabbi said, yes, you could read it that way, and there's nothing wrong with the pleasure between, two loving partners that expresses itself in this way. But more than that, and the reason why the Bible wants to have a book for us is because it's also talking about our relationship with God, and that it should also be passionate and loving and deeply, deeply moving and intimate in that sense. So Shir HaShirim also comes into the category, but not without debate. There was definitely discussion. Question, or you just?
No.
Okay, you look like you were ready. All right, so part 2.
Water of purification, which has done its duty, Beit Shammai pronounces it pure, but Beit Hillel pronounces it impure.
All right, so imagine you have come into contact with a corpse and you need to be made ritually pure. What do we do? Well, it's not just a question of mikvah, it's a question of sprinkling the water that has been mixed with the ashes of the red heifer. Right? That's from Parashat Chukat. It's one of the most famous, bizarre parts of Torah halacha, but you have to trust me when I tell you that the water does its job. Now, the water itself makes the person who's using it ritually impure, and it makes the person who's getting sprinkled with it ritually pure. I told you, this is a part that the rabbi said even Solomon couldn't quite understand. But what happens to the water after you've used it on the person? I knew it was ritually impurifying a second ago, but now I've used it. It's hit the person. Is it still ritually impure? Because after all, it's coming off a person who is now ritually pure, right? So maybe its status changed, right? And indeed, Beit Shammai says, yes, no problem. The water after you've used it is no longer ritually impurifying. But Beit Hillel says, nope, it's still the same water, even though it just finished making someone else pure. It still has the status that it began with, which is to be ritually impure. Right? And yes, that is a hard one to wrap your head around. Welcome to Chukat. Part 3.
Black cumin.
All right, who here likes black cumin?
What is it?
Exactly. So the question is, nowadays cumin is a type of spice, right? So, but the question back then was cumin, especially black cumin, was it a food or not? Right? Because if it's not a food, then I don't have to worry about the whole purity issues. On the other hand, if it is a food, then I do have to worry about them. So black cumin, what did we say?
Beit Shammai says it is not liable to become impure, and Beit Hillel pronounces it liable to become impure. And so too with regard to tithes.
Right. So Hillel also considered it as something that needed tithing because it was a food product. Like you don't have to tithe your pots, because they're not food, but you do have to tithe your crops. And Beit Shammai said, nope, this is not food, and therefore you don't need to worry about tithing, and you don't have to worry about its purity.
If it's not food, then what is it?
It's just another natural substance. Think like, what's that?
Salt is food.
Well, salt would be an example. I'm trying to think of something else that grows that isn't considered a food. Coconut fiber. Right, coconut fiber. Do you eat coconut fiber?
Actually, I have not.
Right. Willow bark.
Oh, I see.
Right? But all of those things are used for other purposes, right? You can weave them into ropes. You can make things out of them, right? You can burn them. So they all have purposes, even if it doesn't mean going into my stomach. But I don't have to worry about my firewood becoming ritually impure. I do have to worry about my crops becoming ritually impure once harvested and all of that, like we've talked about before.
Shouldn't that be an easy question to answer? It's like, are people eating it or not?
Some people did. That was why it was difficult to understand. Right? Some people eat things that aren't actually food.
Really?
Yeah. My grandmother, may she rest in peace, she used to eat asphalt as a child.
Oh.
Not actual asphalt, but the tar. Right? When she was little and they were doing the surface paving in Los Angeles on the roads, this is back in the 20s and such, they used to use just tar, the big bubbling bits of tar. And the neighborhood kids would grab pieces of this, and they would chew on it like gum.
Oh.
Right? Is that food? I don't think most of us would consider that food. Do some people put it in their mouth and act like they're eating it because they enjoy the sensation?
That's how I feel about tobacco.
Yeah, chewing tobacco, even chewing gum in some ways would also be considered a on the border substance of whether this is food or just something that people happen to do with their mouth that looks a lot like eating. And black cumin apparently in their day was something that some people would treat as a food and use as a food. But the question was, does the community have to follow that standard, or does the community say, oh, it's not food, I don't care what you're doing with it, that's not food? And that's Beit Hillel comes down with the idea that apparently it was food enough by his definition. And therefore, you had to treat it as you would any other food. Good? Okay, that finishes us up on 5-3. I knew we could do it.